Monroe County, Georgia, in the middle of July 2021, was sinking under the sweltering heat characteristic of a southern summer. The sun played hide and seek with the clouds, but the air remained thick, humid, and oppressive, making all living things seem sluggish and lazy. Life in this small, rural county flowed on peacefully, almost tediously, following a rhythm set for decades. The residents here mostly made their living from farming and small-scale livestock. Life was not wealthy, but there was enough to get by. They were used to rising with the sun to work the fields and returning home at sunset. Evenings were for gathering around the dinner table before sinking into sleep, ending another uneventful day. In this almost absolute tranquility, no one could have imagined that a horrifying secret, a monstrous crime, lay silent and deep beneath the muddy sludge of a stagnant pond, waiting for the day it would be dragged into the light. The story began on a sweltering afternoon. July 18th, Sarah Miller, a woman in her early 30s, had just finished preparing lunch for her husband and children. Seeing that it was about to rain, she decided to take advantage of the moment to visit her mother's house next door to help out while she was away. Her mother's house, belonging to Brenda Coleman, was just a few yards away, separated by a low wall. It was a simple, single-story home nestled in the middle of a garden overgrown with assorted trees and bushes. Her mother had said she was going to the city to visit relatives for a few days and had asked Sarah to check on the chickens occasionally. After a quick walk around the house to ensure everything was in order, Sarah looked out at the stagnant pond at the far end of the garden. The early summer rains had caused the population of invasive apple snails to explode. She thought it would be a good idea to catch a few to clear them out. With that thought, she rolled up her pant legs above her knees and waded into the pond. The water only came up to her waist. The surface was covered with a thin layer of green algae over murky water. Sarah could feel the soft, cool mud beneath her feet. She bent over, her hands groping in the mud, feeling for the round, smooth shells of the snails. In just a few moments, the plastic bucket she brought with her was nearly full. As she was about to stand up and leave, her hand brushed against something strange. It was not smooth like a snail shell but was rough, round, and hard as a rock. Curious, she used both hands to feel around, trying to figure out what it was. The object was quite large and buried deep under a thick layer of mud. She had to use all her strength to pry it loose. When the object slowly emerged from the water, the mud washing away to reveal its true form, Sarah froze. Her entire body went rigid, her eyes wide as she stared at the thing in her hands. An overwhelming fear constricted her chest, making it impossible to breathe. The bucket of snails fell from her grasp and splashed into the water. It was a human skull, mottled white and green with algae, with two deep, black, empty eye sockets and a jaw of nearly intact teeth bared in a gruesome grin. A blood-curdling scream shattered the midday silence, echoing throughout the garden. Sarah dropped the horrific object and stumbled backward, falling into the murky water. She scrambled and screamed, trying to get out of the cursed pond as fast as she could. Once on the bank, she did not dare look back. She just ran for her life back to her house, still letting out meaningless shrieks of terror. Her screams stirred the small neighborhood. A few curious neighbors ran over and listened as Sarah, her face as white as a sheet, stammered out a story. Everyone was shaken to their core. The Monroe County Sheriff's Office was immediately notified. About 20 minutes later, deputies from the sheriff's office arrived and cordoned off the area around the pond. Recognizing the serious nature of the case, they immediately reported it to the county's Criminal Investigation Division. Before long, detectives and forensic technicians were on the scene. The pond at the end of the garden, the site of the horrific discovery, was quickly secured with police tape. Detectives stood on the bank, looking down at the water still rippling from Sarah's frantic escape. A human skull found here was certainly no accident. This was a crime scene. But who was the victim? And where was the rest of the body? After a quick conference, the lead investigator made a decisive call to drain the pond. A large capacity water pump was brought in. Its engine roared to life, shattering the already tense atmosphere. A large hose was dropped into the pond, and the foul-smelling, murky water began to be pumped out. Everyone present fell silent, holding their breath as they watched, waiting for a terrible truth to be revealed. The water level in the pond slowly dropped, exposing mud, trash, and the shells of apple snails. When only a shallow layer of sludge remained, the pumping stopped. A team in protective gear and waders began to walk through the muck, using long poles to probe the bottom. They did not have to search for long. Near the area where Sarah had found the skull, an officer's pole hit a large, hard mass. He signaled to his colleagues. The team gathered, carefully using their hands and shovels to clear away the thick mud. And then, a nearly complete human skeleton was revealed to everyone, curled in an unnaturally contorted position. But what stunned them all was that the skeleton was not lying there naturally. It was tightly bound with thick nylon rope to a large, heavy block of granite, weighing at least 100 pounds. The rope was cinched tightly around the skeleton's chest and legs. The way it was tied showed that the killer was determined to sink the victim to the bottom of the pond forever, leaving no chance for the body to ever surface. This was a brutal murder and a meticulous concealment of a body. The skeleton was carefully brought to the shore. Forensic experts began their work right at the scene. Based on the bone structure and state of decomposition, they made a preliminary determination. The victim was a male, between 50 and 60 years old, and had been dead for several months. There were multiple fractures on the temporal bone of the skull, indicating the victim had suffered a powerful blow to the head. A detective turned to Sarah, who was still sitting in a corner in shock, being cared for by relatives. He asked her who owned the house and the property. Sarah answered, trembling, that it belonged to her parents. The detective then asked for her father's name and where he was now. She replied that her father's name was Frank Coleman and that he had left home a few months ago to be with another woman. Sarah's answer made the detectives pause. They looked at each other as a cold suspicion began to creep into their minds. The owner of the house, Frank Coleman, was said to have left. But now, a skeleton of a man matching his age had been found in his own pond, tied to a rock. A quick investigation was launched. Using old clothes belonging to Frank that were still in the house, and especially from Sarah's statement that her father had a porcelain crown on a front tooth, the forensic examiners were able to reach a near-certain conclusion. The skeleton found in the pond was none other than Frank Coleman, 60 years old, the owner of this very house. This truth was like a lightning strike for Sarah and the neighbors. Frank had not run away. He had been murdered, and his body had been sunk in this pond for months, just steps away from where his family lived. The story about an old man chasing after a younger woman, abandoning his wife, the story that everyone in the neighborhood had been whispering about, turned out to be nothing more than an elaborate lie, a charade constructed to cover up a monstrous crime. The detectives faced a difficult puzzle. The victim was murdered in his own home and his body disposed of with savage care. So who was the killer? Who had enough time and composure to carry out such a crime and orchestrate such a sophisticated cover-up? The circle of suspicion immediately narrowed, focusing on those closest to the victim, those who were in the house at the time of his disappearance. And the first person to fall under scrutiny was none other than the victim's wife, Brenda Coleman. Where was she, and what role did she play in her husband's death? The simple, peaceful house had suddenly become dark and ominous, hiding a terrible family tragedy that no one could have ever foreseen. To understand the roots of the tragedy, one had to go back in time, about 5 months earlier, to the last days of February 2021. Back then, the Coleman family home was still a home, at least in the eyes of the neighbors. On the surface, it was a typical rural family living under one roof. Frank and Brenda lived in the main part of the house, while their daughter Sarah and son-in-law Rick Miller lived in an adjacent annex connected by a common yard. They still ate at the same table every day, still called each other mother, father, and son with seeming affection. No one could have guessed that behind this peaceful facade was a volcano of sinful desires and simmering resentment, just waiting to erupt. Frank Coleman was 60, an age where one begins to feel the heavy burden of time. A lifetime of hard labor in the fields had worn down his health, leaving him with all the ailments of old age: back pain, sore joints, and high blood pressure. He was a gentle, simple man who, his entire life, had known only his wife, his family, and his plot of land. The love he had for his wife, Brenda Coleman, was as strong as ever. He still had the habit of looking for her first thing when he got home from work, still remembered to buy her the small cakes or sweets she liked. But he never knew, or perhaps willfully ignored, that the wife he adored was growing more and more distant from him. Brenda Coleman, his wife, was only 48. Compared to her husband, who was on the other side of life's hill, she was still quite young and vibrant. A comfortable life without much hardship had allowed her to maintain a trim figure and smooth skin. Especially at this age, an age often called a second spring, The physical desires within this woman were reawakening with a powerful force. But her old, ailing husband could no longer meet those needs. During long nights lying next to the tired body of her husband, who knew only sleep, Brenda often tossed and turned, feeling an emptiness, an indescribable frustration. During the day, she expressed this dissatisfaction through baseless nagging and irritability. She criticized Frank for walking too slowly and for being a messy eater. She was annoyed by his hacking cough every night. But at night, when she was alone with her own desires, that dissatisfaction turned into a burning craving. She began to pay more attention to herself, buying sensual nightgowns and secretly watching steamy romance movies on her phone. She felt like a flower in full bloom, left forgotten in a cracked and aging vase. Meanwhile, the life of the young couple, Sarah and Rick Miller, was not much better. Sarah, Frank and Brenda's daughter, was a gentle, long-suffering woman, much like her father. Her life revolved around her job at a nearby textile mill, and when she got home, she was swamped with cooking and childcare. Her life was a dull, repetitive loop. Rick Miller, her husband, was a 32-year-old man, handsome and tall, but lazy and content with his station. He did not have a steady job, just hung around the house doing odd jobs to help his wife's family. He would either half-heartedly work in the garden or gather with his friends in the neighborhood to drink and gamble. Their marriage had long lost its passion. They lived together out of a sense of duty for their 2 children, not out of love or affection. In the evenings, after dinner, he would often make an excuse to go out or just stare at his phone, while the exhausted Sarah fell asleep. Their lives were 2 parallel lines, coexisting under one roof but rarely intersecting emotionally. And it was in this suffocating, stagnant family atmosphere, where everyone harbored their own private dissatisfaction, that the seeds of sin found fertile ground to sprout. Rick Miller, with his lazy nature, had plenty of free time to observe everything around him. He noticed the unhappy marriage of his in-laws. He also, on more than one occasion, caught the strange way his mother-in-law looked at him. At first, he did not pay much attention, but then her gazes became bolder and her words more suggestive. Brenda frequently found excuses to be near her son-in-law. Sometimes she would ask him to fix a light bulb, other times she would ask him to carry a heavy bucket of water. Each time, she would deliberately create physical contact, a casual brush of his hand, a carelessly low-cut shirt. Rick was no fool. He understood these signals. And instead of feeling disgusted or trying to avoid her, a morbid curiosity began to stir within him. His dull marriage, combined with a taste for the forbidden, led his thoughts astray. He began to pay more attention to his mother-in-law, not with the eyes of a son-in-law, but with the eyes of a desiring man. He found her attractive, still alluring. A sinful, crazy idea began to take root in his mind. The already thin thread of morality finally snapped on one sweltering afternoon. That day, Frank had gone to a distant relative's funeral. Sarah had to work overtime at the mill and would not be back until late. Only Brenda and her son-in-law were left in the house. After lunch, Brenda said she felt a little tired and went to her bedroom to rest. Rick sat outside watching TV for a while, feeling bored. He was about to go out to find his drinking buddies, but as he passed his in-law's bedroom, he heard a strange sound. The door was slightly ajar. Curious, he tiptoed closer and peeked through the crack. The sight that met his eyes made him freeze. On the bed, Brenda was lying there in a flimsy silk nightgown. She was not sleeping, she was pleasuring herself. Her face was flushed, her breathing ragged, her lips murmuring sounds of ecstasy. Suddenly, as if by instinct, Brenda opened her eyes, and her gaze met that of her son-in-law, spying on her through the crack in the door. In a normal situation, a woman would scream in shame and anger. But not Brenda. She froze for a moment, then, instead of pulling the blanket up to cover herself, she stared directly at him. It was a look without a hint of shyness, on the contrary. It was full of provocation and invitation. That look was like a challenge, like fuel poured on the sick desire already smoldering in his heart. Rick swallowed hard. He did not back away. He slowly pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air in the room grew thick, scorching hot. He stood there, staring at the body of the woman old enough to be his mother, and then uttered the words that would become the prelude to an irreversible tragedy. His voice was hoarse with lust, as he suggested that if her husband could not do the job, she should just leave it to him. A chilling silence enveloped the room. Brenda did not yell or curse. She just smirked, a smile that was both contemptuous and challenging. She slowly sat up, letting the thin silk slip from her shoulder, revealing her bare skin. She looked him straight in the eye, her voice just as hoarse as she challenged him, asking if he had the guts. The challenge was thrown down, and the son-in-law did not hesitate to accept. The final boundary of morality and decency was utterly shattered in that instant. The house, once considered a home, had now become the stage for a disgusting, incestuous play. A pressure cooker filled with sin, just waiting for the day it would explode. The bedroom door closed, shutting out the rest of the world, leaving only two people consumed by their sinful desires. Brenda's challenge was the spark that incinerated the last thread of reason in Rick Miller's mind. He lunged at her like a moth to a flame, and the woman, in her second spring, welcomed his embrace with equal ferocity. They fell upon each other, ravenous, as if to make up for all the months and years of frustration and deprivation they had endured. Their first encounter had no tenderness or romance. It was a conquest, a primal release of lust, a crime in which they were both accomplices. After that first brazen act, a sick and twisted relationship was officially established right under Frank Coleman's roof. The house that was supposed to be a sanctuary now became the stage for their disgusting charades. By day, they were mother-in-law and son-in-law, maintaining a proper distance in front of everyone. Brenda was still a wife who cared for her husband, and Rick was still a husband and father to his own small family. But when night fell, when Frank and Sarah were deep in sleep, another world, a world of sin and lust, opened up. They quickly developed a system for their secret trysts. Around 11 or 12 at night, when he was sure everyone was asleep, Rick would send a blank text message to his mother-in-law. That was the signal. Upon receiving it, Brenda would slip out of bed, moving so quietly she did not make a sound, and open the back door a crack. Rick would sneak from his annex across the dark yard, silent as a ghost, and slip into her room. And there, on the very bed where her old husband slept every night, they would lose themselves in each other, satisfying their carnal desires. This sinful relationship completely changed them both. For Brenda, it was like a true fountain of youth. She felt alive again. The release of her long-suppressed desires made her unusually cheerful and radiant. She started to groom herself more, buy new clothes, and wear more makeup. A smile appeared on her lips more often, but it was not the happy smile of a wife, it was the satisfied smile of a fulfilled woman. This secret affair gave her a sense of power. She not only got physical satisfaction but also felt she had triumphed over fate, triumphed over her husband's old age. She grew increasingly contemptuous of Frank. Every gesture of his care and concern now seemed like an annoyance, a sign of weakness in her eyes. Her affection for her son-in-law was not real love either. In her eyes, Rick was just a tool, a healthy young man who could satisfy her cravings. She was the one controlling the game, the one holding all the cards in this relationship. As for Rick Miller, his emotions were far more complicated. At first, he was incredibly thrilled. The act of conquering a woman his mother's age, his own mother-in-law, gave him a sense of sick self-satisfaction, a perverse proof of his manhood. He felt like a superior being, secretly bestowing favors upon a deprived woman. The nightly rendezvous, with the thrill and danger of being discovered at any moment, only added to his excitement. But that excitement did not last. Gradually, it was replaced by a constant, gnawing fear. He began to live on edge, always afraid of being caught. Every time he faced Frank, he could not look him in the eye. The word "dad" from his lips now felt awkward and fake. He feared his wife's gaze, feared his children's innocent questions. He started losing sleep and growing gaunt. The initial self-satisfaction had turned into a psychological burden. He wanted to end this wrongful relationship but could not. He was addicted to it, addicted to Brenda's boldness and power over him. The hunter had become the prey, caught in a trap with no way out. Their audacity grew. At first, they only dared to meet when Frank was sound asleep. But as they got used to it, they became more reckless. Some nights, they would start their affair when Frank had just dozed off in the next room. Once, they even did it on the living room sofa, where the entire family had been watching TV just hours before. And of course, a secret so big could not stay hidden forever. They had several close calls. One night, as they were together in Brenda's room, Frank suddenly turned in his sleep and coughed. Both of them jumped, their hearts stopping. They lay motionless in the dark, holding their breath, listening to every sound. Luckily, Frank just coughed a few times and fell back asleep. Rick was so scared he was drenched in sweat. He hastily dressed and snuck back to his room like a thief. But for Brenda, that fear seemed to be a catalyst. After her lover left, she felt not only anxiety but also a sick thrill from the close call. Another time was even more dangerous. One afternoon, taking advantage of Frank being out in the fields, they had another secret rendezvous. But they did not expect Sarah to get off work early that day. As she walked past her parents' room, she heard her mother let out a soft moan. Thinking her mother was sick, she was about to push the door open to check on her. But as her hand touched the doorknob, she also heard the heavy breathing of a man. She froze. She recognized her husband's voice. A terrible suspicion flashed in her mind, but she quickly dismissed it. She could not bring herself to believe it. She told herself she must have misheard, that maybe her mother was watching a movie on her phone. She quietly returned to her own room, her mind in a turmoil, but she did not dare to confront the truth. These close calls did not stop the two sinners. On the contrary, they pushed their relationship even deeper into the mire. For Rick, each escape made him more fearful, but also more dependent on Brenda's reassurance and protection. For Brenda, the danger only seemed to make the game more exciting. Their relationship had been going on for nearly 5 months. The secrecy had become a habit. But Brenda was starting to feel unsatisfied. She no longer wanted just secret meetings in the dark. She wanted more. She wanted to be openly with her young lover. And the only obstacle in her path was her old husband, Frank Coleman. One night at the end of June, after a passionate encounter, as Rick was about to get dressed and leave, Brenda suddenly hugged him from behind, her voice a whisper in his ear, a voice that was both pleading and resentful. She asked him why he did not take her away from there, suggesting they could go somewhere new where no one knew them and live together. Rick was startled. He questioned where they would go. What about his kids? What about her daughter? And what if Frank found out? Brenda pouted, her voice filled with scorn and disdain. She questioned what he knew, calling him a sick, decrepit old man and just a burden. She mused that if only he were not around, things would be so much better. The words were spoken casually, as if an afterthought, but they sent a shiver down Rick's spine. He felt a cold dread creep up his back. He looked into his lover's eyes. In the darkness, he could not see her face clearly, but he could feel a chilling, ruthless cruelty in her gaze. A terrible idea, one he had never dared to entertain before, suddenly formed in his mind. She was not just talking. He knew that the seed of a crime even more horrific than incest had just been planted in both their minds. Brenda's words, whispered in the dark, were like a poisonous seed planted in the already corrupted soul of Rick Miller. For the next few days, he was restless and anxious. He tried to avoid his mother-in-law, tried to push her haunting words out of his head. He told himself it was just a joke, a lover's complaint in a moment of passion. But deep down, he knew it was not a joke. It was a proposal. A horrifying proposal that opened a direct path to hell. But fear could not overcome the temptation of lust. Just a few days later, he once again found himself unable to resist Brenda's beckoning signals. And then, the fateful night arrived, June 27, 2021. The night was hot and windless, the air so thick it was hard to breathe. After dinner, the family went about their usual routine. Frank watched the news and went to bed early as always. Sarah put the children to sleep and then, exhausted, fell asleep herself. Only the two sinners remained awake, each in their own part of the house, but their minds were on each other. Around 11 p.m., Brenda's phone vibrated. A blank text. The signal had been sent. Brenda slipped out of bed and tiptoed into the living room. She did not close the bedroom door, knowing her old husband slept like the dead. Tonight, she did not want their rendezvous in the cramped, stuffy bedroom. She wanted something bolder. She sat down on the living room sofa in her thin nightgown, waiting for her lover. A few minutes later, Rick Miller slipped in, silent as a shadow. He saw Brenda sitting there, looking all the more seductive in the dim light from the night lamp in the bedroom. Lust once again conquered fear. He rushed to her side, and they fell into each other's arms. They forgot everything, forgot their sin, forgot morality, forgot the husband and father sleeping just a few feet away. They were lost in their own world, a world of betrayal and desire. But tonight, fate would not leave them in peace. In the bedroom, Frank stirred and woke up. His chronic back pain was acting up again. Feeling thirsty, he got up to go to the kitchen for a glass of warm water to ease the pain. He walked slowly, silently, his bare feet familiar with the cool tile floor. As he stepped out of the bedroom, he froze. Before him was a scene he could never have imagined, even in his worst nightmares. In the dim glow of the night light, his wife, the woman he loved with all his heart, and his son-in-law, the man he treated like his own son, were entwined on the family's living room sofa. Time seemed to stop. Frank's entire world shattered in that instant. The glass of water fell from his hand and shattered on the floor, the piercing sound tearing through the silence of the night and snapping the two sinners back to reality. Rick and Brenda jumped apart. When they saw Frank standing there, stunned like a stone statue, the color drained from Rick's face. He was panicked, stammering incoherently for his father. But Brenda was different. After a brief moment of confusion, her face quickly became cold and hard. She showed no fear or remorse. She simply pulled her nightgown back into place, sat up straight, and looked at her husband with a defiant glare. Frank could not hear anything anymore. His ears were ringing. His heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. The pain of betrayal was 1,000 times worse than any physical pain. He looked at the wife he had shared his life with, then at his son-in-law. His gentle eyes were now bloodshot, filled with the fury of utter contempt. His voice trembled and broke as he called them animals, godless creatures. He staggered toward them, his old body shaking with rage. The fury gave him an unexpected strength. He did not go for his wife. All the rage of a cuckolded man was directed at his son-in-law. He screamed at Rick, reminding him how he had treated him like a son, given him food and a roof over his head, and questioning how he could do such a vile, disgusting thing. Frank raised his hand to slap Rick, but Rick, being a healthy young man, instinctively raised his arm to block it. The unequal confrontation turned into a struggle. In his rage, Frank grabbed Rick's collar and, with all his might, shoved him against the wall. Rick, terrified and caught off guard, began to fight back, pleading hopelessly for his father-in-law to listen to him. Frank roared at him to shut his mouth, screaming that he was no son of his. The two men, one old and one young, grappled in the small living room. Furniture was knocked over with a crash. Frank's curses, Rick's pleas, and Brenda's screams all merged into a chaotic, crazed symphony in the dark. Brenda initially tried to intervene, but then she just stood there, watching the two men fight over her, a strange mix of panic and excitement in her eyes. The struggle reached its peak. In the scuffle, Frank grabbed a ceramic vase from a table. He raised it high, intending to smash it over his sinful son-in-law's head. Rick, in a state of absolute panic, seeing his life threatened, stopped thinking. He used all the strength of a young man and shoved Frank hard. It was a powerful shove, a shove born of fear and desperation. Frank, already old and frail and in an agitated state, could not withstand it. He staggered backward a few steps, his feet tangled, and lost his balance. A sickeningly dry, horrifying crack echoed through the room. Frank's back hit the wall, but his head slammed directly into the hard, sharp corner of the heavy oak credenza. Sudden silence descended upon the room, a silence so profound it was terrifying. Frank did not make another sound. His eyes bulged for a second, then slowly closed. His old body went limp and slid to the floor. He lay there, motionless. From the back of his head, a dark stream of blood began to seep out, spreading across the white tile. Rick and Brenda stood frozen. The panting from the struggle had ceased, replaced only by the frantic pounding of their own hearts. The son-in-law stared at the motionless body of his father-in-law, his hands trembling violently. Brenda brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Their crime of incest had now escalated into an irreversible tragedy. Frank lay there, life unknown, and the two sinners stood at the precipice of a fateful decision, a decision that would either salvage what little humanity they had left, or push them both even deeper into the mire of sin. The silence after the sickening crack was thick and seemed to stretch into eternity. For a moment, both Rick Miller and Brenda Coleman stood frozen, their horrified eyes glued to Frank's body sprawled on the floor. The blood continued to spread, a ghastly crimson stain on the cold tile, gruesome proof of the tragedy that had just unfolded. The adrenaline and panic from the struggle vanished, replaced by a primal, bone-chilling fear that seeped into every cell, squeezing the hearts of the two sinners. Rick was the first to snap out of it. He began to tremble violently, his teeth chattering. He could not believe what had just happened. His shove, an act of self-defense, had led to this horrific outcome. He staggered forward, his legs threatening to buckle. He knelt beside his father-in-law, his trembling hand reaching out to shake him. He whispered for his father to wake up, his voice hoarse and broken by sobs. But Frank did not respond. His breathing was shallow, faint. His eyes remained closed. The pool of blood under his head grew larger. Rick pressed his ear to Frank's chest. The heartbeat was incredibly weak, almost imperceptible. Absolute panic consumed him. He had done something terrible. He had hurt his father-in-law, maybe killed him. He would go to jail, he would have to pay. The only thought that flashed through his mind was to run. He had to escape the crime, escape it all. He scrambled to his feet, about to bolt for the door, muttering like a madman that he had to go, had to run. But as he turned, a cold hand clamped down on his wrist, holding him fast. It was Brenda. He turned to look at his lover and was stunned. The initial horror on her face was gone, replaced by a terrifying calmness. Her eyes were no longer panicked, they glinted in the darkness, sharp, cold, and calculating. She was not looking at the dying man on the floor. She was staring straight into her lover's eyes, her voice a dry, steely hiss, asking where he thought he was going. Rick stammered that they had to run, that his father was dying, trying to pull his arm free. Brenda snapped at him to shut up, her voice a powerful whisper. She warned that if he ran now, they were both dead. She questioned if he really thought he could get away, pointing out that the police would find him in a day and that he would then rat her out, leading to them both rotting in a cell. Her words were like a bucket of ice water on Rick's panic, jolting him back to the grim reality. She was right. Where could he run? Everyone knew he was Frank's son-in-law, that he lived right here. He asked, trembling, what they should do now. He was now completely at the mercy of this woman. He suggested taking Frank to the hospital, to the E.r. A flicker of hope ignited in his mind. If they got Frank to a hospital in time, maybe he would survive. Then his crime would be less severe. He could beg for forgiveness. But Brenda extinguished that fragile hope with a cold, chilling smirk. She asked if he was insane to suggest taking him to a hospital. Her voice dripped with contempt as she laid out the alternative. Frank waking up and telling Sarah, the neighbors, and the police everything. She questioned if he wanted the whole world to know they were having an affair in his house, saying there would be no face left to live with. It would not just be prison, she warned, but a shame so deep they would have to drown themselves. Every word she spoke was like a dagger twisting in Rick's already tormented mind. He stood there, speechless. She was right. If Frank lived, their lives were over. Their honor, their family, everything would be destroyed. They would become the disgrace of their entire lineage. Seeing her lover waver, Brenda moved closer, her voice a demonic whisper in his ear, planting an idea in his head that he would never have dared to conceive on his own. She told him there was only one way out of this now. She paused, letting the silence and darkness amplify the weight of her next words. He could not be allowed to live. If he lived, there was no way out for them. They had to kill him. If they killed him, the secret would be buried forever. Rick's whole body convulsed as if struck by lightning. He looked at the woman before him as if she were a monster. To kill him, to kill his father-in-law. He had never imagined he could do something so monstrous. He stammered that they could not, that it was murder, and asked if she was crazy, taking a step back. Brenda hissed that she was not crazy, that he was the fool. She grabbed his shirt collar and pulled him close. She questioned if he thought he had another choice, reminding him that things had gone too far. She insisted he was the one who pushed him, the one who committed the crime, and that she was just helping him find a solution. She laid out the choice. Either both of them go down, or only Frank does. She told him to choose. Her words were both a temptation and a threat. She had skillfully shifted all the blame onto him, turning him from an accomplice into the main perpetrator. Rick looked down at Frank's body, then back at Brenda's magnetic, terrifying eyes. His mind was in turmoil. On one side was the fear of the crime of murder, of legal punishment. On the other was the fear of humiliation, of losing everything. In that decisive moment, his selfish survival instinct won. The fear of his incest being exposed, the fear of being scorned by the world, was somehow greater than the fear of committing murder. Seeing that her lover was no longer resisting fiercely, Brenda knew she had succeeded. The demon within this woman had fully awakened. She let go of Rick and walked silently into the kitchen. A few seconds later, she returned. In her hand was a heavy wooden pestle. The pestle they used every day to grind spices, still flecked with black pepper, was now about to become a murder weapon. She said nothing, simply held the pestle out to Rick. The son-in-law stared at the object in his lover's hand, his own hand shaking uncontrollably. He did not want to take it, but Brenda's eyes, a gaze that was both a command and an encouragement, seemed to have a hypnotic power, forcing him to reach out. His hand touched the cold wood. Brenda whispered for him to do it, her voice devoid of any emotion. She urged him to do it quickly, before anyone found out. Urged on by his lover, cornered by his own terror, Rick Miller was no longer himself. He was a puppet on a string. He turned and walked toward his father-in-law, who lay dying on the floor. He squeezed his eyes shut, unable to look at the man's face. Images of all the times Frank had been kind to him, treated him like a son, flashed through his mind. But then the disgusting image of his own sin, the vision of prison and shame, rose up and overpowered everything else. He raised the heavy wooden pestle high. Then, in a frenzy of panic and despair, he brought it down. A sickening, wet crunch echoed in the room. Then a second, and a third. He struck again and again, madly, at the head of the man he once called Dad, as if trying to beat away his own fear, his own sin, with every blow. Blood splattered, speckling his face and shirt. He only stopped when Brenda placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice as cold as ice, telling him that was enough, that he was dead. Rick Miller opened his eyes. The wooden pestle slipped from his grasp and clattered onto the floor. He looked down at his handiwork. Frank's skull was crushed, unrecognizable. He staggered back and collapsed onto the floor, clutching his head, his body convulsing. The crime was complete. The final line between man and monster had been crossed. In the living room, thick with the metallic smell of blood, the two murderers sat with the body of their victim. But while the son-in-law was lost in a storm of panic, the woman, the mother-in-law, was unnervingly calm. She looked at her husband's corpse without a shred of emotion. In her mind, a new plan was already forming, a plan to cover up this horrific crime. The house was submerged in a thick silence, broken only by Rick Miller's ragged, gasping breaths. He sat huddled in a corner, head in his hands, his body still twitching after the frenzied act of violence. He did not dare look at his father-in-law's body, did not dare look at the pool of blood spreading across the floor. His mind was a blank void, consumed by a primal fear that had swallowed everything else. He had killed someone. His hands were stained with blood. This crime, he knew, would follow him for the rest of his life. While her lover was collapsing, Brenda Coleman was preternaturally calm. The initial panic was gone. Now that the ultimate crime had been committed, now that there was no turning back, the ruthless and cold survival instinct inside this woman had fully awakened, taking complete control. She wasted no time on fear or regret. She looked at her husband's corpse, then at her trembling son-in-law. In her mind, a plan, a way out for them both was rapidly taking shape. She walked over to Rick. No comfort, no blame. She grabbed his arm and yanked him to his feet. Her voice sharp and cold, she ordered him to get up. She warned that this was no time to sit there crying and asked if he wanted the police to come in the morning and haul them both away. Her coldness seemed to have a strangely calming effect on Rick. He lifted his face, stained with tears and blood, and looked at her as if she were a savior, asking what they should do now. Brenda commanded him to listen to her, now in total control. She said that first, they had to clean the place up, leaving not a single drop of blood. Then, they had to get rid of the body, dumping it somewhere no one would ever find it. As soon as she spoke, she acted. She went to the bathroom and brought back a bucket of water, rags, and a bottle of bleach. She threw a rag at Rick. She told him to wipe and get it all clean while she took care of the other stuff. She calmly collected the shards of the broken glass and wiped fingerprints from a vase. She got clean clothes for Rick. His blood-stained clothes and the wooden pestle all went into a black plastic trash bag. Her actions were decisive and methodical, without a hint of hesitation, as if she had done this 100 times before. Like a robot, Rick silently did as he was told. He knelt on the floor and began scrubbing away the blood of the man he had just murdered. The thick, metallic smell of blood made him want to vomit, but Brenda's sharp, knife-like gaze was fixed on him, and he did not dare stop. He wiped and re-wiped, then scrubbed the floor with bleach, trying to erase every trace of their crime. After nearly an hour, the crime scene was unbelievably clean. The floor was dry, without a single bloodstain. The furniture was back in its original position. If it were not for Frank's body, now covered with a thin blanket, no one would ever guess a brutal murder had just taken place here. Brenda's tone unchanged. She said it was time for the body. She decided they would take it out to the pond behind the garden, calling it the safest way. The stagnant pond at the end of the garden, a place she knew was deep and full of mud. Rick stammered that it would float up. Brenda replied curtly that it would not. She had a plan and told him to follow her. She led Rick out to the backyard, where Frank kept various odds and ends. She pointed to a large, heavy block of granite used to prop up a planter. She told him to bring it inside and find a strong rope. Under the dim moonlight, the two murderers began a task even more gruesome than the cleanup. They struggled to roll the heavy rock into the house. Then, they began to tie up the body, with Brenda directing. She had Rick turn the corpse over, and together they strained to wrap nylon rope around Frank's chest and legs, then secured it tightly to the rock. The work was done in a chilling silence, punctuated only by their heavy breathing and the creak of the rope being pulled taut against flesh. When they were finished, they began the final, disgusting journey, taking the victim to his eternal resting place. They could not carry the body, it was too heavy. They had to put it on a wooden plank, one pulling and one pushing, dragging it across the yard to the back garden. The sound of the planks scraping against the dirt in the dead of night sounded like a mournful wail. At the edge of the pond, they did not pause for long. With all their remaining strength, they heaved. A loud splash broke the stillness. The body, along with the rock, sank into the black water, leaving only a few bubbles that quickly vanished into the deep mud. The pond's surface rippled for a moment, then returned to its deathly, placid state. Their horrifying secret was now buried at the bottom of the pond. They stood there, panting, covered in sweat and mud. The crime was concealed, but Brenda knew it was not enough. They needed a story, a perfect performance to deceive everyone. The next morning, Brenda woke up early as usual. She went to the local market, greeting neighbors, but with a sad, worried expression. She told a few close neighbors that she and her husband had a terrible argument the previous night. Her husband, Frank, had gotten angry, packed a few bags, and left in the middle of the night. She even managed to squeeze out some tears, lamenting that he had probably run off with some woman from the city he had been secretly seeing. The story of Frank abandoning his wife for a mistress quickly spread through the neighborhood. People felt a mix of pity for her and contempt for the old man who still chased after younger women. No one suspected a thing. A few days later, to perfect her plan, Brenda went to the market again. This time, she bought a large bag of live apple snails. When she got home, she casually dumped them all into the pond. When her daughter, Sarah, asked why, she simply replied that it was to help clean the water, and besides, they would have something to catch and eat later. It was a final, brilliant, and cruel move. She knew that apple snails reproduce quickly and are voracious eaters. The body at the bottom of the pond would be consumed by them in a matter of months, leaving nothing but bare bones. The charade was perfectly constructed. Frank Coleman had officially vanished from the face of the earth. Brenda played the role of a pitiful, abandoned wife. Rick Miller played the role of the dutiful son-in-law, always by his mother-in-law's side to comfort her. They lived together under one roof, continuing their incestuous relationship, now with no obstacles. They were bound together not by love, but by a horrifying secret, an unforgivable crime lying deep in the stagnant pond right behind their home. The deceptive drama created by Brenda Coleman and Rick Miller was flawlessly executed. For 5 months, they lived on top of their crime, continuing their sick, incestuous relationship under the guise of a peaceful family. Their daughter, Sarah Miller, and all their neighbors in Monroe County suspected nothing. They only felt pity for the unfortunate woman abandoned by her husband and sympathy for the devoted son-in-law who stayed to care for his mother-in-law. That terrible secret might have been buried forever in the mud if not for that fateful afternoon when Sarah waded into the pond to clear out snails. When the skeleton of Frank Coleman was recovered, the curtain fell on their act. The investigation by the Monroe County Sheriff's Office moved swiftly. In a homicide case where the victim was found on his own property, The circle of suspicion immediately closed around the only two people living with him at the time of his disappearance, Brenda Coleman and Rick Miller. Both were brought to the station for questioning. Initially, they remained calm, especially Brenda. Facing the detectives, this woman delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. She wept, she collapsed, she spoke of her shock and horror upon learning her husband had not left her but had been murdered. She insisted she knew nothing and even concocted a theory that her husband might have had a business dispute with someone who came to the house for revenge. Her testimony was smooth, flawless. Her face and gestures conveyed the profound grief of a widow. Rick Miller was not nearly as composed. Although his lover had coached him thoroughly, the psychological weight of the crime had been crushing him for months. He tried to stick to the script, but his face was perpetually pale, his eyes darted around, and his hands trembled as he clasped them together. He repeated the story of Frank leaving after an argument, but his voice lacked confidence and was full of contradictions. The experienced detectives immediately recognized Rick as the weak link. They decided to separate the two for interrogation. With Brenda, they temporarily let her continue her act. With Rick, they focused all their efforts on breaking down his psychological defenses. In the interrogation room, a detective placed crime scene photos on the table. A photo of the skeleton tied to the rock and a close-up of the shattered skull. The detective told him to take a look, his voice low and firm. He explained this was not a revenge killing but a calculated murder with a very sophisticated plan to hide the body. The killer had to be someone who knew the house and the yard very well and had plenty of time to do all this without being noticed. He asked Rick who he thought that could be. Rick looked at the photos, and a cold sweat broke out on his neck. He stared at the table, not daring to look up, and claimed he did not know. The detective's voice rose, questioning how he could not know. He reminded Rick that he lived right there, was the only man in the house when the victim was murdered, and yet he knew nothing. He went on to say that forensic science is very advanced and that they could find the smallest trace, that even a single hair or a fingerprint would be enough to expose the killer. He advised that a full confession was the only thing that could help him now. The pressure mounted. Questions came one after another, drilling into the inconsistencies in his story about the night Frank disappeared. He became more and more flustered, his answers contradicting each other. The wall of lies he had tried so hard to build began to crack. Finally, when another detective brought the actual skull from the evidence locker and placed it on the table directly in front of him, Rick Miller completely broke down. The image of his father-in-law's skull, which his own hands had shattered, now sat before him like a silent accuser. The guilt and fear that had been suppressed for 5 long months burst forth. He broke into racking sobs, then buried his head on the table, confessing his entire crime. He told the story from beginning to end, from the incestuous affair with his mother-in-law to the fateful night Frank discovered them. He recounted the struggle, Frank's fall, and in his confession, he tried to shift all the blame onto his lover. He claimed he had only accidentally pushed Frank and that it was Brenda who had coldly decided the victim had to die to silence him. He described how she had handed him the pestle, how she had goaded and forced him to do it, and how she had calmly masterminded the entire cover-up. Once they had Rick's confession, the confrontation with Brenda Coleman became much simpler. The detectives played her a recording of her lover's confession. Hearing Rick's voice, hearing him pin all the blame on her, the mask of grief on Brenda's face instantly hardened. Her tear-filled eyes went dry and blazed with fury. The sorrow vanished, replaced by a seething, visceral rage at being betrayed. She hissed through clenched teeth, calling him a bastard and a coward. She could not believe he dared to say that, insisting he was the one who killed her husband. With her final mask torn away, Brenda had nothing left to hide. In her fury, she confessed everything, but with a different version, that Rick was the mastermind who wanted to kill Frank so they could be together freely. The two demons, after committing a heinous crime together, now turned on each other, tearing each other apart in a desperate attempt to escape justice. Several months later, the trial began. In the courtroom, the two former lovers looked at each other with nothing but hatred. They relentlessly blamed each other, denied their own guilt, and exposed the full, disgusting details of their incestuous relationship and their cruel actions, shocking everyone present. But the crime was undeniable. Based on their mutual confessions, combined with the forensic evidence and the crime scene investigation, the jury had more than enough to reach a final verdict. The court found the defendants' actions to be particularly heinous, stemming from an illicit relationship that violated all moral decency, leading to them taking the life of their own father and husband. The act had caused extreme outrage in the community and demanded the most severe punishment. The jury delivered its sentences. The defendant, Rick Miller, as the one who directly and brutally carried out the act of murder, was sentenced to the maximum penalty, death. The defendant, Brenda Coleman, as the mastermind who instigated the crime, not only failing to stop it but actively aiding it, demonstrating a complete moral depravity, was sentenced to life in prison. The sentences were read, but the tragedy was not over. It had utterly destroyed a family. The father and husband was dead. The wife and son-in-law would pay with their lives in prison and on death row. All that was left was the most pitiful victim of all, Sarah Miller. In a single day, she lost her father, her mother, and her husband. She became the biggest victim of a crime committed by the people she loved most, left alone to face the pain, the shame, and the burden of raising two small children, innocent children who would now have to grow up in the shadow of an unforgivable family tragedy.